Imagine standing on a wall, looking out at the enemy. You see a whole army, of course. But then, beyond the soldiers, you see something else. Something huge. It's moving. Slowly, deliberately, it rolls towards your city. Maybe it's a tower, taller than your tallest building. Or maybe it's a giant crossbow, bigger than any tree, aiming its bolts right at your heart. Your stomach drops. This isn't just war. This is a siege. And these are the machines of terror. For thousands of years, people have fought to take or defend cities. The walls went up, and then immediately smarter, bigger, more brutal ways to break those walls came right after. It was an endless, bloody competition. From the first simple logs swung by a few men to the complex, articulated beasts of war that weighed tons, siege weapons changed history. They ended empires. They started new ones. They made legends and they created unimaginable fear. Think about it. What does it take to build something that can smash stone? To throw a rock weighing hundreds of pounds over 100 yards? To move a multi-story fortress right up to an enemy's ramparts? It took incredible engineering, back when there were no engines, no modern tools. Just human muscle, ingenuity, and a terrifying purpose. And what about the people inside? Imagine the sound of that ram hitting the gate again and again. Or the thud of a massive stone landing inside the city walls. What did that do to their will to fight? It's hard to truly grasp the scale of that fear. These weren't just tools, they were statements. They were psychological warfare, and they were truly terrifying. We're talking about machines that redefined how war was fought, how cities were built, and how people lived. They shaped the ancient world in ways we still feel today. Number 17. How did simple ladders become instruments of terror? People often think of ladders as basic, and they are, but imagine hundreds, even thousands of them all at once. Picture a city wall maybe 40 feet high. Suddenly, the enemy appears from everywhere, carrying these long, heavy timbers. They rush the wall, pushing and shoving. It's a terrifying rush, a race against time for both sides. The defenders try to push them back, to smash them, to boil them with oil. The attackers are desperate to get over. Ladders were probably the very first siege tools. As soon as people built walls, others tried to climb them. You see evidence of them from the earliest fortifications. For example, archaeologists have found fortifications at places like Jericho, dating back thousands of years. They had walls, and people would have used something to get over them. Ladders were that something. They weren't just simple wooden planks, though. Over time, designs got smarter. Some ladders were built in sections, so they could be carried more easily and then put together at the wall. Others were reinforced, made wider, or had hooks at the top to grip the parapet. A lot of Roman military manuals, like those by Vegetius, talk about the importance of ladders even when bigger machines were around. He talks about how crucial it was for soldiers to be trained in their use, both for climbing and for defending against them. The terror of ladders came from their sheer numbers and the direct, brutal hand-to-hand combat they forced. It wasn't about a machine breaking a wall from a distance. It was about men swarming, clawing their way up, knowing they'd face armed defenders at the top. It was a direct assault on the most vulnerable part of a city, its defenses against direct entry. The historian Diodorus Siculus describes scenes where hundreds of men would try to scale walls simultaneously during sieges, like the siege of Syracuse by the Romans. The noise, the confusion, the sheer mass of humanity trying to get over it must have been an incredible, dreadful sight. And the risk was immense for the attackers. A ladder could be pushed over, sending dozens of men plummeting to their deaths. Or it could be set on fire, roasting those trying to climb. Yet, they kept using them. Why? Because sometimes that was the only way in. Or it was a feint to draw defenders to one section of the wall while the real attack happened elsewhere. We know ladders were used, but how exactly were they made strong enough to bear the weight of armed men and still be light enough to carry quickly? Do different cultures have unique ladder designs that we've lost knowledge of? And what was the exact psychological impact on a defender seeing 100 ladders rise simultaneously? How did commanders coordinate such a chaotic, simultaneous assault? Number 16. What made Greek fire so terrifyingly effective? Greek fire wasn't a siege weapon in the sense of breaking down walls. It was a liquid. But it was propelled by pumps or siphons, turning it into a devastating stream of burning death. It's often associated with naval battles used by the Byzantine Empire, But it was also used in sieges, both defensively from city walls against attacking forces, and sometimes offensively when armies had access to similar incendiary devices. It was the ancient world's napalm, but worse because it burned on water. The first documented use of Greek fire was in a naval battle in 672 AD during the Arab siege of Constantinople. The Byzantines used it to defend their capital, and it was devastatingly effective. The historian Theophanes, the confessor, writes about how the liquid fire was thrown onto enemy ships, causing panic and destruction. This wasn't just fire, it was a chemical weapon, a secret formula that the Byzantines guarded with extreme jealousy for centuries. The terror of Greek fire came from its properties. It couldn't be put out with water. In fact, water often made it worse, spreading the flames. Sand, vinegar, or urine were sometimes used, but even then, it was incredibly difficult to control. Imagine a thick, sticky, burning liquid spewing from a pipe, setting everything it touched ablaze, including people. The smell, the sound, the sight of men burning while their comrades couldn't help them, it was horrific. While the exact formula is lost, scholars like John Halden and Maurice Byrne have studied the historical accounts and suggested possible components. They think it might have involved petroleum quicklime sulfur and possibly resins or oils. The quicklime, when mixed with water, could have generated intense heat, igniting the petroleum. This theory is supported by accounts of it burning on water. It was more than just fire, it was psychological warfare. The very mention of it struck fear into the hearts of enemies. The Byzantines had a massive strategic advantage for centuries because of this weapon. It allowed them to hold off much larger forces. When besieging forces approached city walls, if the defenders had access to Greek fire, they could rain down burning liquid on siege engines, on attacking soldiers, clearing out approaches, or burning tunnels. It forced armies to rethink their tactics, to be wary of every dark opening or strange device. The formula for Greek fire is still a mystery. Could it be rediscovered, or are the raw materials and ancient processes truly gone forever? How exactly was it propelled? Were there different versions of Greek fire used by different Byzantine emperors? And how did soldiers cope with the psychological trauma of seeing their comrades consumed by unquenchable flames? Number 15. Why were war elephants sometimes used as siege weapons? War elephants. You usually think of them on open battlefields, charging lines of infantry, breaking formations. But these massive animals, with their sheer power and imposing size, were also sometimes used in sieges. Not to throw stones or climb walls, but to directly attack the strongest part of a city's defenses, its gates. The use of war elephants dates back to ancient India, possibly around 1100 BC, and spread across Asia and then to the Mediterranean world. Persian emperors like Darius III used them against Alexander the Great. Pyrrhus of Epirus famously brought them to Italy, terrifying the Romans. The Carthaginians, most famously Hannibal, also used them. For a siege, an elephant was essentially a living, breathing battering ram. Their immense strength meant they could smash into wooden gates, trying to splinter them or break their hinges. They could also be used to clear obstacles, stomp through lesser fortifications, or simply create chaos and panic among defenders. Historian Polybius describes the use of elephants in sieges during the Punic Wars, noting their psychological effect on those behind the walls. The terror came from their physical power and their psychological impact. Imagine being a guard behind a wooden gate, hearing the trumpeting, then seeing the massive head of an elephant ramming into the timber again and again. The gate would groan, wood would splinter, the ground would shake. It was a terrifying, almost primal assault. Elephants were often armored themselves, making them even more formidable. They carried towers on their backs from which archers or javelin throwers could rain down missiles onto defenders trying to stop them. But elephants had weaknesses. They could be frightened by noise, fire, or pigs. The Romans, for example, learned to drive them mad with loud noises or by sending flaming pigs towards them. They could also be difficult to control, sometimes turning on their own side if they panicked. Despite these issues, their use in sieges, even limited, highlights the desperate ingenuity of ancient warfare. They were a living, monstrous weapon that added a layer of terror unique to ancient battlefields. How effective were elephants truly against well-constructed, iron-reinforced gates? Was their use more about psychology than pure destructive power in sieges? What was the mortality rate of elephants used in such direct assaults? And how did armies train these animals to consistently attack gates without turning on their handlers? Number 14. What made the tortoise musculus testudo a vital and fearsome siege tool? The Roman tortoise, or testudo, wasn't just a military formation of shields. In siege warfare, it was a specialized mobile protective shed, often called a musculus little mouse or a vinia. Think of it as a moving, armored tunnel. It was built with strong timber and covered with hides or layers of earth to protect against fire and missiles. Its purpose was simple: to get soldiers, particularly sappers or those operating a ram, right up to the enemy wall without being slaughtered. These were heavy structures. They needed many men to push them forward on rollers. Julius Caesar himself described the construction and use of such machines in his Commentari de Bello Gallico, Gallic Wars, and Commentari de Bello Civili, Civil War. He detailed how Roman engineers created these protective covers to allow his troops to approach enemy fortifications, dig mines, or deploy rams against gates and walls. The terror of the tortoise wasn't in its ability to destroy, but in its relentless, unstoppable advance. Imagine being on the walls. You see this low, broad, armored shape moving towards you. You throw stones, shoot arrows, drop fire. Nothing seems to stop it. It just keeps coming. Underneath it, are enemy soldiers, safe, methodically working to undermine your defenses. It's like a slow, inexorable monster, the sound of tools digging beneath the walls, or the muffled thud of a ram, all protected by this unyielding shell, must have been incredibly unnerving. The design was clever. The roof sloped to deflect projectiles, the sides were strong, and often fresh earth was piled on top to absorb impacts and prevent burning. These machines allowed sappers to dig tunnels beneath walls, causing them to collapse, or allowed engineers to set up battering rams in relative safety. Without such protection, the casualties from missile fire would have been too high to sustain such close quarters work. The musculus, specifically as described by Caesar, was used in the siege of Massilia Marseille in 49 BC. He noted how it protected soldiers filling the moat and laying siege works. It was a testament to Roman engineering and their relentless approach to taking fortified positions. It proved that sometimes the most terrifying weapon wasn't one that blew things up, but one that allowed destruction to happen methodically, safely, and inevitably. How many different designs of these protective sheds were there across various ancient armies? What specific materials were most effective for their armor against different types of projectiles? How long did it take to construct a musculus or a vinia on site, and what resources were needed? And what was the actual success rate of these covered approaches in achieving breakthroughs against heavily fortified positions? Number 13. How did the Helepolis earn its name as a city taker? The Helepolis was not just a siege weapon. It was a mobile fortress, a multi-story monster of wood and iron. Its name, City Taker, in Greek, says it all. This was the pinnacle of ancient siege engineering, a massive armored siege tower that often incorporated battering rams and multiple levels for missile troops. The most famous Helepolis was built by Demetrius Poliorcetes the Besieger during his siege of Rhodes in 305 BC. According to Diodorus Siculus and Vitruvius, this machine was enormous. The Rhodes Helepolis was said to be around 125 feet high and 60 feet square at its base, weighing over 160 tons. It had multiple levels, each housing different types of projectile weapons: catapults, ballistae, and archers. It was armored with iron plates and covered with hides to protect against fire. It was mounted on huge wheels, needing hundreds, possibly thousands, of men to push it. The terror of the Helepolis was multi-layered. First, its sheer size. Imagine this colossal structure rolling towards your city walls, towering over everything, bristling with weapons. It wasn't just a tower, it was a psychological weapon that broadcasted the attackers' immense resources and determination. Defenders on the walls would suddenly find themselves looking up at enemy soldiers, or even on the same level, making their positions untenable. Second, its destructive power. It carried its own heavy artillery, capable of clearing defenders from the walls with a barrage of stones and bolts. Some designs even integrated heavy rams at their base, allowing them to simultaneously batter the walls while missile troops suppressed defenders. The idea was to create a mobile platform that could overwhelm a section of the wall, allowing troops to bridge over directly onto the ramparts. Demetrius's Helepolis at Rhodes was a marvel, but also a cautionary tale. The Rhodians eventually managed to stop it, not by destroying it, but by flooding the ground in front of it and digging trenches, trapping it. Despite its ultimate failure at Rhodes, the concept of the Helepolis, a superweapon combining multiple siege functions, influenced siege engineering for centuries. It proved that size and complexity could be terrifyingly effective. How many Helepolis-type siege towers were successfully used to take cities? Were there smaller, more practical versions of the city taker that were more widely adopted? How did they overcome uneven terrain or moats before specialized ramps were developed? And what were the exact internal mechanisms for moving such a massive structure and elevating the heavy weaponry within its multiple floors? Number 12. How did mobile protective sheds Vinia Pluvius allow attackers to get close? They're like the tortoise, mobile protective sheds such as the Roman Vinia or Pluvius were not offensive weapons themselves. They were support structures, but they were absolutely critical for getting offensive weapons and soldiers close to enemy walls. Without them, most direct siege work would have been suicidal. These sheds were temporary, movable covers designed to shield troops from missile fire as they approached fortifications, filled ditches, or built siege ramps. The Vinia was essentially a lightweight, open-ended shed about 8 feet high, 8 feet wide, and 16 feet long. It was constructed from timber, with a roof covered in wattle and hides, sometimes reinforced with earth or clay. They were often placed side by side, forming a continuous covered walkway, allowing soldiers to advance in relative safety. Its plutae were smaller, more maneuverable, curved shields on wheels, offering protection to individual or small groups of soldiers performing specific tasks like sapping or observation. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Before these, approaching a wall was like walking into a storm of arrows, javelins, and stones. Now, soldiers could move forward, shielded from above and one side. Vegesius, in his De Re Militari, discusses the construction and use of these types of defenses, emphasizing their necessity for any prolonged siege operation. He notes how vital they were for protecting engineers and labor troops. The terror these sheds instilled was subtle but profound. The defenders on the walls would see these seemingly innocuous structures moving closer, slowly but surely, like parasites. They couldn't stop them with direct fire. They knew that underneath, unseen, the enemy was working, undermining their walls, filling their ditches, or preparing for a direct assault. It was the feeling of a creeping, inevitable threat that couldn't be directly engaged. They allowed for the systematic dismantling of a city's outer defenses. Under their cover, engineers could build siege ramps, operate battering rams, or even mine beneath the walls, all while being relatively safe from the defenders' missiles. For example, during Caesar's siege of Alesia in 52 BC, his engineers used vast numbers of these protective structures to construct his famous circumvallation and contravallation lines, allowing them to work day and night under protection. How durable were these sheds against different types of projectiles, like heavy stones or fire arrows? What specific organizational methods did armies use to construct and deploy hundreds of these structures efficiently during a long siege? Were there cultural variations in their design and materials beyond the Roman examples? And how often were they successfully countered by defenders through means other than direct missile fire? Number 11. How did the Scorpion prove that precision could be just as terrifying as brute force? When you think of ancient siege weapons, you usually picture massive stone throwers, but the Roman Scorpion, or Scorpio, was different. It was a bolt thrower, essentially a giant, highly accurate crossbow, but powered by torsion springs. It wasn't about smashing walls, it was about killing people on the walls with frightening precision and speed. Named for its sting, the Scorpion was smaller than a ballista, but incredibly effective. It could fire large, heavy bolts like giant arrows with tremendous force and accuracy over long distances. Accounts from authors like Vitruvius and Ammianus Marcellinus describe its capabilities. Vitruvius, in his De Architectura, details the torsion principle that powered these machines. He talks about how bundles of sinew or hair were twisted to create the energy for launching projectiles. The terror of the Scorpion was personal. It could pick off individual defenders from a distance. Imagine being on a wall, thinking you're safe behind your parapet, and then a heavy bolt suddenly splinters the wood next to your head. Or worse, finds its mark. It wasn't random, it was directed. Roman General Scipio Africanus, for instance, used similar devices during sieges. And Caesar's legions employed them to great effect during the Gallic Wars, often mounting them on siege towers or earthworks to clear enemy ramparts. Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman historian of the 4th century AD, wrote vividly about the power of these machines. He described how a well-aimed bolt could pin a man to a wall or tear through multiple enemies. The rate of fire was also a factor. Trained crews could reload and fire quickly, creating a relentless barrage. This made it very difficult for defenders to man their stations or repair damage, as they were constantly under threat from precision fire. The Scorpion forced defenders to stay hidden, reducing their ability to return fire or counter other siege efforts. It changed the dynamic of wall defense, turning previously safe positions into deadly traps. Its psychological impact was immense. Soldiers weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting a machine that could hunt them down individually. It was a clear demonstration that technology could make killing more efficient and more terrifying. What was the effective range and maximum destructive power of a standard Scorpion bolt against armored soldiers? How many Scorpions did a typical Roman legion field during a major siege, and how were they deployed for maximum effect? Are there any intact Scorpion mechanisms or detailed engineering drawings that fully explain their construction? And how did enemy forces adapt their defenses to counter the accurate, targeted fire of these bolt throwers? Number 10. How did mining and sapping become a weapon of silent, creeping destruction? Most siege weapons are about brute force or projectiles. Mining and sapping are different. They involve digging. Tunnels. It's a silent, hidden war fought beneath the ground, and it was one of the most terrifying methods of ancient siege warfare. Attackers would dig tunnels under enemy walls or towers, intending to collapse them or to secretly breach the city. This technique is ancient, used as early as the Assyrians, and perfected by the Greeks, Romans, and later civilizations. The Roman engineer Frontinus, in his Stratagemata, describes various instances of successful mining operations. The basic idea was to dig a tunnel, often shoring it up with timber as they went. Once the tunnel was underneath the target section of the wall, the wooden supports would be set on fire. As the timber burned, the ground above would collapse, bringing down the wall. The terror of mining was in its invisibility and its inevitability. Defenders couldn't see the attack coming. They would only hear the faint sounds of digging, if they were lucky enough to have sensitive ears or specialized listening devices like placing a bronze shield on the ground to amplify vibrations. That sound, the knowledge that an unseen enemy was slowly, methodically working beneath your feet was pure dread. It was like living on a fault line waiting for the earthquake. One of the most famous examples comes from the siege of Ambracia in 189 BC, where the Romans tried to mine under the city walls. The defenders discovered the tunnels and engaged in brutal underground combat. Another well-documented instance is the siege of Dura Europos in the 3rd century AD, where archaeologists found a Roman countermine filled with the skeletons of Roman and Sasanian soldiers, caught in a desperate subterranean battle. This specific archaeological discovery, studied by scholars like Simon James, provides chilling evidence of the reality of this hidden warfare. Mining required immense effort, careful engineering, and brave, claustrophobic work. It could be countered by countermines, where defenders would dig their own tunnels to intercept the attackers. But if successful, it was devastating. A section of wall, carefully built over generations, could suddenly crumble, opening a breach for the attacking army. It was a terrifying, silent, and often unexpected end to a city's defenses. How did ancient sappers navigate underground accurately without modern surveying tools? What techniques did defenders use to detect hidden tunnels beyond simple listening? How often did countermining operations lead to direct, hand-to-hand combat deep underground, and what were the tactics involved? And what was the long-term psychological effect on a besieged population knowing their walls could crumble at any moment from below? Number 9. What made the battering ram the most iconic and terrifying wall breaker? The battering ram is probably the first thing most people think of when they imagine ancient sieges. A massive log, often tipped with an iron head, swung repeatedly against a gate or a wall. It was simple, it was brutal, and it was incredibly effective. From the earliest walled settlements to the late Middle Ages, the ram was the quintessential wall-breaking weapon, a symbol of relentless destruction. Early rams were just tree trunks. Men would carry them and run them into gates. But they quickly evolved. The Assyrians were using sophisticated covered rams by the 9th century BC as depicted in their palace reliefs. Later, the Greeks and Romans refined them. A typical ram was a huge timber beam, sometimes over 100 feet long, suspended from a frame within a mobile protective shed. This shed protected the operators from missiles and fire, and often had wheels or rollers. The ram itself might have an iron head, often shaped like a ram's head, to maximize impact and concentrate force. The terror of the ram was its sound and its persistence. Imagine being inside the city, hearing that rhythmic, thunderous thud 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 against the gate or wall, vibrating through the ground, shaking the very foundations of your defenses. Each hit was a direct assault on the city's integrity, a slow but steady chipping away at its strength. The Roman writer Vegetius described rams as among the most effective siege engines. These machines were operated by teams of men, often dozens or even hundreds, pushing and pulling ropes to swing the beam. The longer the ram, the greater the leverage and force. Some rams were so heavy they had to be suspended by chains or ropes, allowing them to swing with even greater momentum. Engineers like Archimedes, during the siege of Syracuse, famously devised countermeasures against Roman rams, showing how formidable they were. The ram forced a direct confrontation. Defenders would try everything to stop them, dropping heavy stones, fire, hot oil, grappling hooks to snag the ram's head. But if the protective shed held, and the ram kept hitting, eventually something would break. A gate would splinter, a section of wall would crack. The battering ram was a testament to the idea that given enough time and enough force, even the strongest defenses could fall. How much force could the largest ancient battering rams deliver with each strike? What were the most common weaknesses in ancient gate and wall construction that rams exploited? Are there any detailed engineering specifications of a specific successful ram that tell us its exact construction? And what was the immediate psychological effect on soldiers and civilians when they heard the first cracks appear in their primary defenses? Number 8. How did the ballista become the ancient world's giant sniper rifle? The ballista was essentially a giant crossbow, but it wasn't powered by a simple bowstring. It used torsion. Imagine two massive bundles of twisted animal sinew or hair. Arms were inserted into these bundles. When the arms were pulled back, they twisted the bundles tighter, building up immense elastic energy. Releasing the arms launched a massive bolt or javelin with incredible force and accuracy. This wasn't for smashing walls, this was for killing. The Greeks developed early versions, but the Romans perfected the ballista. It became a standard piece of siege artillery. Authors like Vitruvius detailed their construction and principles. These machines could fire heavy bolts, often around 3 to 6 feet long, weighing several pounds over considerable distances, sometimes hundreds of yards. The bolts were often tipped with iron or bronze, capable of piercing armor or embedding deeply into wood and stone. The terror of the ballista came from its power and precision. It could clear defenders from walls, disable enemy siege engines, or target specific individuals with deadly accuracy. Imagine a bolt the size of a man's arm flying towards you with tremendous speed. Vegetius praised the Roman army's artillery, including the ballista, for its destructive power against both fortifications and enemy personnel. During the siege of Masada in 73 AD, the Romans used ballistae to bombard the fortress, driving defenders from the walls and covering the construction of their massive siege ramp. The remains of ballista bolts have been found at many Roman siege sites, providing tangible evidence of their use. They weren't just for heavy assault, they could also be smaller, more portable versions used by legions in the field. The ballista was often mounted on a sturdy wooden frame, sometimes on wheels. It needed a crew of several men to operate, reload, and aim. Its ability to project lethal force with precision made it a game changer. It forced defenders to stay behind cover, reducing their effectiveness, and made any direct engagement on the walls extremely dangerous. It was the sniper rifle of the ancient world, delivering terrifying, targeted death from a distance. How many different sizes and power levels of ballistae existed across various empires, and how were they designated? What was the typical rate of fire for a well-trained ballista crew during a prolonged siege? Are there any archaeological discoveries of intact ballista components that shed light on their torsion bundle construction? And what psychological effect did a constant barrage of heavy ballista bolts have on a city's defenders? Number 7. Why was the onager such a feared stone-throwing catapult? The onager was a formidable Roman catapult, famous for its ability to hurl heavy stones with immense force. Its name means wild ass, supposedly because of the violent kick it made when fired, or perhaps the kicking motion of its arm. It was a torsion engine, similar in principle to the ballista, but designed for throwing large, heavy projectiles in an arc, not for firing bolts in a straight line. The onager typically had a single throwing arm inserted into a massive bundle of twisted sinew or hair. This arm ended in a sling or a cup that held the projectile. When the arm was pulled back and then released, the twisted bundle would rapidly untwist, launching the stone. These machines could launch stones weighing from 50 to 100 pounds, sometimes even more, over distances of 200 to 400 yards. The terror of the onager was its raw, destructive power. Imagine a giant boulder suddenly raining down from the sky, crashing into buildings, smashing into walls, or landing with devastating force inside a city. These stones could collapse roofs, destroy fortifications, and cause massive casualties among civilian populations. They were not precise, but they didn't need to be. Their job was to inflict widespread damage and psychological trauma. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus vividly describes the onagers' destructive capabilities. He talks about how they were used to batter walls, disrupt enemy formations, and inflict terror. During a siege, a battery of onagers could continuously bombard a city, turning civilian life into a nightmare. The constant threat of these massive projectiles forced people into cellars and shelters, disrupting daily life and eroding morale. The onagers were often built on sturdy timber frames, sometimes mounted on wheels or skids for limited movement. They required a substantial crew to operate, load, and tension. The engineering involved in creating such a powerful torsion engine, capable of withstanding the stresses of repeated firings, was impressive. It demonstrated the Roman genius for practical, brutal engineering, turning simple physics into a terrifying engine of war. How accurately could an onager be aimed at a specific section of a wall from a distance? What were the maximum projectile weights and ranges achieved by different onager designs? Are there any detailed Roman military manuals describing the construction, maintenance, and tactical deployment of onagers in detail? And what was the long-term structural damage inflicted on city walls by prolonged onager bombardment compared to the effects of battering rams? Number 6. What made the trebuchet the most powerful stone thrower of the Middle Ages? While we're talking about ancient weapons, it's worth noting the trebuchet, even though its golden age was in the medieval period. It represents the pinnacle of stone-throwing technology from the ancient world in a broader sense, evolving from simpler traction trebuchets that were used in late antiquity. The true counterweight trebuchet, as we commonly think of it, appeared around the 12th century, but its predecessors set the stage. The traction trebuchet, pulled by human power, was used by the Chinese as early as the 4th century BC and appeared in the Mediterranean by the 6th century AD. The fully developed counterweight trebuchet was a marvel of physics. It used a massive counterweight strategy, sometimes weighing tens of tons, to swing a long arm, launching projectiles with incredible force. This was a gravity-powered machine. The arm would be pulled down on the short end, raising the heavy counterweight. When released, the weight would fall, snapping the long end of the arm upward, flinging a projectile from a sling. The terror of the trebuchet was its immense power and reach. It could hurl massive stones, sometimes weighing several hundred pounds, over incredible distances, often exceeding 300 yards, sometimes even 500 yards. Unlike the onager, which relied on the spring of twisted sinew, the trebuchet used the constant force of gravity, making it more consistent and often more powerful for truly massive projectiles. Imagine a stone the size of a small car, or even a dead animal, arcing through the sky and crashing into your city. The sheer scale of destruction was unprecedented. Walls could be breached not by repeated chipping, but by massive shattering blows. The sound of these monstrous stones hitting stone or buildings or people must have been utterly demoralizing. The Werewolf at the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, built by Edward I of England, is a legendary example, though from the medieval period. And it was so large, it was largely symbolic, forcing surrender before it was fully deployed. But even the traction trebuchets of earlier eras, used by the Byzantines against the Avars in 626 AD, were capable of throwing stones and causing significant damage. They evolved to become the most feared besieging engine, capable of delivering unparalleled destructive power to city walls and buildings. What was the largest projectile ever successfully launched by an ancient traction trebuchet, and what kind of range did it achieve? How did engineers calculate the optimal counterweight to arm ratio for maximum power and range? Are there any surviving detailed designs or archaeological findings of traction trebuchets that show their specific construction? And how did a city's defenders physically and psychologically cope with the relentless bombardment of such immense projectiles for weeks or months? Number 5. How did siege hooks and grappling irons turn walls against themselves? Siege hooks and grappling irons weren't glamorous like catapults or rams. They were simple, often brutal tools, but they represented a terrifyingly direct threat to the integrity of a city's defenses. These were essentially large, heavy iron hooks, often with multiple prongs attached to long ropes or chains. They were used to literally pull down sections of walls, towers, or battlement features, or to help attackers scale them. Their use probably dates back as long as people built walls. Any strong point that could be grabbed could be pulled. Accounts from ancient sieges, although sometimes lacking explicit detail on these specific tools, imply their use in weakening fortification. The general principle of using leverage and force to dismantle structures is evident in various siege tactics. The terror of hooks and irons was in their insidious nature. Imagine being on a wall and seeing these crude metal claws fly up, snagging onto your battlements, a crenellation, or even a wooden parapet. Then you see lines of enemy soldiers pulling on ropes, straining to dislodge or collapse the very structure you're standing on. It's a direct, physical assault that feels personal. It tells you the enemy isn't just trying to go over or through your walls, they're trying to take them apart piece by piece. They were often deployed from siege towers or from the ground, hurled over the wall, and then pulled by many men. If successful, they could tear down wooden defenses, dislodge loose stones, or create footholds for climbers. In some cases, massive iron hooks were mounted on long poles, or even on wheeled vehicles, to act as large crowbars, prying at weak points. The Syracusans, under Archimedes, famously used giant iron claws, the claw of Archimedes, against Roman ships, which were essentially massive grappling hooks to lift and capsize vessels, a testament to the power of such tools. While primarily naval, the principle of using a mechanical claw to attack a structure is similar. These tools were about creating weaknesses and exploiting them. They might not destroy a whole wall in one go, but they could weaken it enough for rams to finish the job, or open up gaps for infantry. They were a constant, nagging threat, forcing defenders to continuously repair and reinforce their walls, diverting resources and manpower. It was a terrifying reminder that no part of the wall was truly safe from being torn down. How strong were the ropes and chains used for the largest ancient grappling hooks to pull down stone? What was the largest section of wall ever recorded as being pulled down by such devices? Were there specific defensive measures developed to counter these grappling attacks beyond simply cutting the ropes? And how effective were small individual grappling hooks used by soldiers for climbing compared to ladders in terms of success rate and casualties? Number 4. How did the corvus, originally a naval weapon, become a siege threat? The corvus, or raven, is most famous as a Roman naval boarding device. It was a long gangplank with a heavy spiked beak on the underside designed to grapple onto enemy ships. But the ingenuity behind the corvus, the idea of a mechanical arm with a piercing head, could certainly be adapted to siege warfare. Imagine it on land, on a massive siege engine or tower, extending to grapple onto ramparts or fortified positions. It's not a direct siege weapon in the sense of breaking walls, but it acts like a bridge and a tool for creating breaches and engaging defenses. Polybius, the Greek historian, describes the corvus in detail, especially its use in the First Punic War 264 to 241 BC. The Romans, not traditionally a naval power, used it to turn sea battles into, land battles, leveraging their superior infantry. So they would ram an enemy ship, drop the corvus, and then swarm across. This innovation allowed them to win crucial naval victories. The terror of the corvus, even when adapted for land-based sieges, would have been its ability to bridge gaps and create an immediate, inescapable fight. Imagine a long, heavy arm extending from a siege tower, its spiked beak slamming down onto your parapet. It pierces the wood or wedges into the stone. Suddenly, you're not just fighting people climbing ladders, you're fighting people who can march across a stable platform directly into your defenses. It's an instant forced breach. While not explicitly described in land sieges in the same way as its naval use, the principle of using a hinged, heavy grappling beam to connect two structures and transfer troops or create a stable attack point is a clear parallel. Such a device could be used to grapple onto a gatehouse, allowing troops to stream onto its roof, or to connect a siege tower more securely to a wall. It was about creating an immediate, overwhelming advantage at a crucial point. Its land equivalent could have been a specialized type of siege bridge or boarding ramp with added grappling capabilities. The beak could have also been used to snag and pull down loose sections of ramparts, or to remove obstacles. It was a frightening example of Roman adaptability, and their willingness to innovate to achieve dominance, turning what was a strength for defenders their walls into a liability by forcing a direct, unavoidable confrontation. Are there any archaeological or textual hints of land-based adaptations of the corvus principle in ancient sieges? How might the mechanics of a naval corvus be scaled up and adapted for use against a stone wall? What specific structural weaknesses of ancient fortifications would a land-based corvus exploit most effectively? And how would defenders respond to a siege engine that could suddenly grapple onto their walls and create an instant bridge for enemy troops? Number 3. How did the portable ladder evolve into a mass weapon of desperate assault? We talked about ladders earlier, but let's consider them again, not just as simple tools, but as part of a mass assault. When you picture a siege, you often imagine big machines. But the most common, most direct, and in some ways most terrifying attack was always with portable ladders. These weren't fancy, they were wood, but in the hands of hundreds, thousands of desperate soldiers, they became a mass weapon. Their use is as old as walls themselves. Every culture that built fortifications also used ladders to attack them. The simplicity is deceptive. While a single ladder is easily pushed over an entire army, each unit carrying multiple ladders, presenting a wall of timber against a wall of stone, is a different kind of terror. This was the default mode of assault for many ancient armies when heavy siege engines were not available or had failed. The terror of the mass ladder assault was its brutal directness and the sheer overwhelming numbers. Defenders would see wave after wave of attackers, each carrying a ladder, rushing towards the walls. It was a race. Would the defenders kill enough attackers before they could set their ladders? Would they push them over fast enough? The noise alone, the shouts, the thud of ladders hitting stone, the clang of weapons must have been deafening and petrifying. Historians like Thucydides, describing the siege of Plataea in 429 BC, mention the use of scaling ladders in night assaults. The element of surprise, combined with the sheer number of ladders, could overwhelm even well-manned defenses. The Roman army, despite its sophisticated siege engines, still trained extensively in ladder assaults. They understood that sometimes brute human wave attacks were necessary. This tactic forced defenders to spread their forces thinly along the entire length of a wall, creating vulnerable points. It demanded constant vigilance and an enormous amount of physical effort from the besieged. Ladders, in their simplest form, represent the raw, desperate courage of attackers willing to risk everything for a chance to get over the wall. And for defenders, they represented the constant, unyielding pressure of an enemy determined to break in, no matter the cost. What was the typical casualty rate for attackers in a mass ladder assault compared to other siege methods? How were these ladders constructed to be both sturdy enough for multiple men and light enough to be carried at speed? Did different cultures have specific types of wood or reinforcing techniques that made their ladders superior? And what were the most effective defensive countermeasures against a large-scale ladder assault beyond simply pushing them over or throwing fire? Number 2, how did the siege tower become a mobile fortress of assault? The siege tower was perhaps the most visually terrifying of all ancient siege weapons. It was a multi-story wheeled wooden tower, often taller than the city walls it attacked. Its purpose was to deliver armed men directly onto the enemy's ramparts, bypassing the need for ladders or breaching the wall itself. It was a mobile, protected bridge, a vertical assault platform. The earliest known use of siege towers dates back to the Assyrians, around the 9th century BC, depicted in their palace reliefs. The Greeks, particularly during the Hellenistic period, developed them further, with the Romans perfecting their designs. Diodorus Siculus describes the use of massive siege towers by Demetrius Poliorcetes, already mentioned with the Helepolis, which was the ultimate form of such a tower. These machines were engineering marvels of their time. The terror of the siege tower was immense and immediate. Imagine seeing a building-sized structure, bristling with archers and javelin throwers, rolling slowly but inevitably towards your city walls. It blocked out the sun, it towered over your defenses. Defenders, who moments before had the advantage of height, suddenly found themselves eye level with the enemy, or even looking up at them. Siege towers were built with multiple levels. The lower levels often housed battering rams or specialized boring tools. The middle levels were for archers and slingers, providing covering fire. The top level would have a drawbridge or ramp that could be lowered onto the enemy wall, creating an instant pathway for attacking infantry. They were usually covered in hides or iron plates to protect against fire and missiles. Their construction was a massive undertaking requiring huge amounts of timber, skilled carpenters, and engineers. They were pushed by hundreds, sometimes thousands of men, often protected by advancing sheds like vignae or by filling moats to create a level path. The siege tower at Masada, used by the Romans under Flavius Silva in 73 AD, was built on a massive ramp. It allowed Roman troops to finally breach the fortress. It showed that with enough effort and a big enough tower, no wall was impregnable. How long did it typically take to construct a large siege tower, and what logistical challenges did this present to ancient armies? Were there any specific architectural designs for siege towers that proved more effective against different types of fortifications? How did defenders try to sabotage or destroy siege towers during their construction or approach beyond fire? And what was the immediate psychological impact on defenders when a siege tower finally docked with their wall, bridging the gap? Number 1. What made the catapult onager so terrifyingly destructive? Let's end with the generic catapult, but specifically focus on the onager once more as a prime example of a terrifying ancient stone thrower, often simply called a catapult. While the term catapult covers a range of devices, the onager, with its brute force and specific action, embodies the raw destructive power that armies sought. It was a machine designed to destroy walls, buildings, morale, everything. Developed by the Romans, improving on Greek designs, the onager was the workhorse of heavy artillery for centuries. Its core mechanism, as we discussed earlier, was a single throwing arm inserted into a massive, tightly wound bundle of sinews. When released, this arm would violently whip upwards, launching a projectile from a bucket or sling. This was not a precise instrument, it was a blunt instrument made for breaking. The terror of the onager was its ability to deliver widespread, indiscriminate destruction from afar. It wasn't just targeting soldiers, it was targeting the city itself. Imagine the continuous, crushing bombardment. Stones weighing hundreds of pounds, thudding into buildings, tearing through roofs, smashing into streets. The sound alone was terrifying, the creak and groan of the machine, the snap of the arm, the whistle of the projectile, and then the earth-shattering impact. These machines could launch projectiles far enough to bypass outer defenses and strike deep within the city. This meant that even civilians, who might feel relatively safe behind the walls, were now directly under attack. This was a form of psychological warfare, aimed at breaking the will of the entire population, not just the soldiers. Flavius Josephus in the Jewish War describes Roman catapults which would include onagers and ballistae during the siege of Jerusalem, launching massive stones that could shatter battlements and cut down ranks of men. He even mentions the distinct sound of the approaching projectiles, which terrified defenders. The onager represented the culmination of ancient stone-throwing technology before the full advent of the counterweight trebuchet. It was a commitment to total war, to not just fighting an army, but to dismantling an entire city, brick by brick, morale by morale. It was a terrifying testament to human ingenuity applied to destruction, a machine that turned gravity and torsion into an engine of devastation that laid low countless ancient cities. What was the specific organizational structure of an ancient Roman artillery corps that managed these large machines during a protracted siege? Are there any surviving military records that detail the psychological impact of prolonged catapult bombardment on civilian populations within besieged cities? How did different types of stone, limestone, granite, etc. affect the destructive power and range of an onager? And how exactly did ancient engineers transport the massive components of multiple onagers across long distances and then assemble them on site for a siege?